Good evening. Thank you for watching our current affairs briefing in English. Today we're going to examine the Vitals and Stewards contracts with Dr Edward Debono. Thank you very much, Dr. Debono, for agreeing to give us an update on the situation with the hospital's contract.
My pleasure.
What's the situation today, right now?
The situation right now is that, as you are aware, on the 24th of February 2023, Mr. Justice Francesco De Pasquale has decreed that the action filed by Dr. Adrian Delia in his own name as a Member of Parliament and as leader of the Nationalist Party was correct and according to law, and that the contract signed between government and Vitals is fraudulent. Now, some are saying that the judge did not decree that government officials were fraudulent and corrupt, but that only Vitals were corrupt. The public is to understand that for there to be corruption, there's not only the corrupt, but as well the corrupted. It is a bilateral thing. It is not something which involves only one side, but there has to be the other side who has received monies not according to law. And why am I saying this? Because the political mantra of the Labour Party is saying that no persons were indicated as being corrupt in government, and this is totally not on and not correct. Why? Because Mr. Justice Francesco De Pasquale, in his judgment, he included the report of the auditor, which states, and I'm going to quote on page 44 of the said judgment, that the evidence indicating collusive action between the parties acting on behalf of government with the investors of Vitals renders the entire process dubious, irrespective of whether the process was in adherence with procedural and regulatory requirements. You and I, and the public in general, will understand that collusive action means fraudulent action. Collusive action means that there was a corrupt deal, there were persons who were corrupted, and there were persons who received the money from the corrupter. And this is very serious because he is indicating parties acting on behalf of government. And who was acting on behalf of government? You know as much as I do that before the request for proposals was issued, Chris Cardona, as a Minister of State, had signed a memorandum of understanding with Vitals, establishing the parameters of what was required of them for them to be considered as contractees.
So the memorandum of understanding was signed
prior to the request for proposals. So it was a done deal, because first you issue a request for proposals, and then after you choose the preferred bidder, you will come to a memorandum of understanding. You don't sign a memorandum of understanding before the request of proposals is submitted, put to the public in general to see whether they can submit their own proposals and have a fair, level playing field.
We're now going to have a look at a service by Net News.
Vitals Stewards ħatfu flus il-poplu b'erq, mhux minħalq is-sinjur, iżda minħalq il-marit u l-batut tant fil-bżonn. Min wassal biex il-poplu jiġi frodat, weġġa lill-pazjenti u lill-aktar nies vulnerabbli. Fejn hemm il-qerq u l-frodi, flus il-poplu għandhom jiġu rkuprati. Saħħaq dan il-President tal-Assoċjazzjoni Medika Maltija, Martin Balzan, waqt laqgħa li kellu mal-kap tal-Partit Nazzjonalista Bernard Grech, laqgħa li matula saħaq kif il-kawża tal-Vitals kienet kruċjali għall-qasam tas-saħħa.
Intnefqu miljuni kbar, mijiet ta' miljuni kbar u ma sar investiment f'xejn. Aħna nirringrazzjaw il-Partit Nazzjonalista li għamel din il-kawża li reġa' ġab daw l-isptarijiet luri għand il-poplu Malti. Issa ninkoraġixxu l-Gvern biex jagħmel minn kollox biex iġib lura l-flus li tajnihom u dak l-investiment li ma sarx fis-saħħa, fis-settur tas-saħħa fl-aħħar 8 snin, issa jagħmel mod li jsir u jsir kif kellu jsir għab-benefiċċju tal-pazjent.
Going back in time, was there a need for the hospitals to be managed by a third party?
I don't think so, because both the Medical Association of Doctors as well as the Nurse Association and other organizations which were involved with the medical profession all objected that something of the sort should be given. They all felt that our hospitals should be managed by Maltese people as they were managed throughout the years. It is evident that the Labour government of 2013, as soon as it came to power, wanted to make this deal with this person called Ashok and Ram Tumuluri, who had no experience in managing a hospital, but they just had Ayurveda clinics, which basically means massage clinics, and we entrusted them with the management of our hospitals without any medical experience. And obviously, the Medical Association and the Nurses Association were up in arms that something like this should not be happening. But the government just didn't want to take any note of what was being said. And what happened? What happened is that they said that they were going to invest over 200 million in building the Gozo Hospital as well as refurbishing the St. Luke's Hospital and the Karen Grech Hospital, when in actual fact, after a period of 3 years, which were granted in the deed of temporary emphyteutical concession for them to complete what were called milestones, they didn't do anything of the sort, and yet Conrad Mitzi decided to grant them a further extension and more money without them delivering.
What about the transition of the contract from Vitals to Stewards?
I'm coming to this now, because after extending the period, and Vitals did not actually deliver, Chris Fern had told us now that the real deal was coming through, basically with Stewards. And government approved the transfer of the shares in Vital Group to Stewards Healthcare. But they didn't deliver neither. They did not build the Gozo Hospital, they did not refurbish St. Luke's, and they did not refurbish Karen Grech Hospital. The only thing that the judge found that they did was the janitor's room in Gozo. This is absolutely ridiculous.
Did any due diligence take place for the two companies?
Supposed to have taken place, because before Vitals were granted the contract, Indus, which is the entity, the government entity, instead of Malta Enterprise, appointed a group of people to see whether this deal or the persons who were behind the deal were capable of delivering. But when they were put to the witness stand, they started all stuttering and saying that they were not authorized to enter into to see whether they were capable of doing this job. How is it possible that Minister Mitzi could appoint this group of people without specifying correctly and according to law that a due diligence should have taken place? None of them said that they did this. They passed on the buck from one to the other. And obviously, then, one has to come to the conclusion that no due diligence was done by Indus, Malta Enterprise, basically. In the circumstances, how can one possibly understand that after the leader of the opposition, Dr. Adrian Delia, filed his lawsuit, Conrad Mitzi had the audacity to sign a side letter where he stated that if the court were to annul this concession, Malta would have to give Stewart Healthcare 100 million euros.
So how does that stand today?
Today, once the contract is declared fraudulent by the courts, obviously, according to the Latin maxim, fraus omnia corrumpit, which basically means that when there's fraud, any agreement reached between the parties is not to be considered valid at law. So I can't understand and see how Stewart Healthcare can go to court and ask that the Maltese government pay them the amount of money which they had fraudulently agreed to come to an agreement with Conrad Mitzi.
Many people have commented about this contract. Let's have a look at what some of them had to say.
There was a request by this company for a further injection of money, which clearly shows that, notwithstanding what they might have stated before they were granted the contract, they clearly did not have the financial muscle, the financial ability, the financial liquidity to be in a position to deliver on what they had contractually obliged themselves to do. And the government was very happy to, notwithstanding this fact, give them another injection of capital, again money from our taxpayers, which we taxpayers pay. There is also another issue. Usually when you are dealing with rules of public procurement, Leah, for the benefit of those who are hearing us, are issues where Maltese and Cositans taxpayers' money from the Maltese coffers, and the Maltese coffers are basically filled by what each and every one of us pays in taxes. When you are going to do something like this, you should also carry out a certain amount of due diligence on the person to whom you are going to give such a hefty contract. It is an obligation on anybody who is entrusted with the management of Maltese and Cositans taxpayers' money to ensure that this is used appropriately. And this is why due diligence takes place. This is why you check out on who is going to be receiving this tender or that other tender, be it building a pavement, be it building changing some bulbs in the road, or be it, as it was, the provision of a number of beds and a considerable refurbishment in the 3 hospitals that you have mentioned.
98% of the people who are already being utilized are already Maltese, and irrespective of whether they are Maltese, foreign, and what have you, the amount of investment that we are putting every single year, because when I'm saying 80 million, 90 million, it is pay over and above what we used to pay before, not as a totality with respect to this part of the health sector, it is over and above. So irrespective of who is doing it, the management, the hospitals have to come back to the Maltese. We are pledging that we will do that, whether through motion, whether through court, whether through eventually government, because the Maltese have proven time and again that in the health sector we are second to none, and we are very much able to deliver service of excellence to Maltese and foreigners alike in our country.
Well, we're talking about the repatriation of the asset recovery principle, which is critical. It's a fundamental principle of the UN Convention Against Corruption. And there you have the blueprint of criminal as well as civil procedures that can be followed through mutual assistance, investigative techniques, and all kinds of other instruments in order to ensure that victims of corrupt practices are made whole. And when the state is the victim, then the funds are returned to the treasury. So there are all kinds of both criminal and civil procedures to be followed. The process is expensive and laborious, and sometimes it takes long periods of time in order to come to fruition. But new technologies and new ways of investigating this kind of misconduct have become available and can be put to good use in order to address at the same time all these things at once. And both financial vigilance and good governance with respect to the health sector, but more broadly, public-private relations, to me, seems to be a high priority for Malta at this junction.
And this, in looking at it and reviewing it, and I made myself a table just like I would have done in something like Enron, and it just reminds me, it couldn't be a worse situation, because there's so much conflict of interest, there's lack of transparency, there wasn't effective due diligence, there are ties between government and the private sector, and if that's the way that Malta does business, with offshore funding into companies that might not be companies, I think that will impact very badly.
We're not embarrassing ourselves, our government is embarrassing us. And the political will has to come from everybody, obviously from ourselves, from the Nationalist Party, from the opposition, from the government, from the people. But primarily it has to come from the people. But let's get back to Vitals. Vitals is actually a case in point. I mean, when one looks at even the top headlines of the the auditor as a report, it's clear the whole thing was set up with, I was almost going to say criminal intent, but I don't want to get a libel case. But yes, it was criminal intent. Let's be obvious. Let's be clear about this. This whole thing was set up in order for people to make money. And the people who did it either are complete fools because they didn't realize what was happening around them, or else they were in on it. Now, if you're going to tell me Edward Debono is a complete fool, well, I mean, frankly, he's the man who said he's paid peanuts. When you pay peanuts, you know what you get. But I mean, that's Edward Debono. He can live with his own conscience. To say that Conrad Mizzi is a complete fool, well, I mean, Conrad Mizzi's name has come up in every shady deal that this country has been embroiled in by this bunch of crooks.
I think there is no other choice in terms of the present government, in terms of the Prime Minister's decision. There is the summary, the executive summary of the Auditor General that dictates, rightly so, that this should be null and this contract was not ever transparent from the beginning, and it didn't safeguard the citizens of Malta and Gozo. Even it basically went on to give a better situation for the private investors instead of the government of Malta protecting our citizens, which remained basically in a situation where they don't even know what's happening with this situation.
If there is a person besides government who suffered out of Vitals, it's me. Because when Vitals came, this man, Tumuri, met me and he wanted to buy Capua Hospital. I mean, Zaytun was not open as yet. He wanted to buy Caspa. And I know what I passed through this fraudist man. He's a big fraud. I mean, the way he talks, he convinces you that he knows everything about health. The way he was talking, I think he must have done a big research on me, the way I talk and the way I think about the private health sector, because he was talking to me about his plans and I was saying, but what he's saying is exactly what I would wish to see, how I would wish to see the health sector develop in Malta. And I mean, yes, I fell prey to this fraudist. But the truth is that after a year, 2 years almost, of negotiations, he never put one single cent on the table. Unfortunately, I was being given advice to give him a chance because it's difficult to get money out of America and all this. And I was all the time believing all this until one day he made a proposal which I said, this man is playing me about. But I mean, the damage that this man caused to our hospital financially and even family-wise, what he caused, the problems he caused me family-wise are huge problems. But that is only me. But now what is coming out of how things were negotiated, I mean, first of all, I'm disgusted and I'm hurt as a Maltese, the way we Maltese are treated and the way these foreigners were treated. Fortunately, I'm talking about people who today have been chucked out of politics, fortunately. But what is coming out today is more than scandalous. And yes, I would be the first one to praise and say thank you to the Prime Minister if he were to get these people back to Malta and make them pay for every single cent which they spent and they took in their pockets to build their villas in Switzerland.
Where Edward gave testimony and Vitals case. Where we all know we are talking about a 2,000 million plus case to regain the hospital's promoted. And I quote, so that there is misinterpretation on many sides. When I specifically questioned him about how this deal was given, he said that he was not involved. When I specifically asked him whether he knew about the memorandum of understanding before the tender was issued, which means, according to the words of the Auditor General, that there was collusion with governments and the foreign companies who stole our hospitals, he said he had no idea. When then I said whether he knew about the 100 million addendum to that contract, 100 million out of our monies, he said that this was something he did not know about. And when I asked him what he did when he got to know about that, because he had given testimony that there are things which make you suspect and things which actually are red flags, and I said, so even after you got to know about this 100 million addendum, did that get you in a position to raise your eyebrows at all? Because that's the specific clause he used. And he said no. When he asked whether he had a meeting, whether he spoke to the Prime Minister, whether he challenged the fact that out of the funds of our country, and he was the Minister of Finance, entrusted to take care of our funds, he didn't raise a finger.
Absolutely.
When asked about the contract with the Vitals and how it took place, he said that there were no red flags.
Corruption has become a way of life. It's a culture. The government has inculcated, instilled, fomented this culture.
obviously here we are talking of money laundering offences, and once we're talking of money laundering offences, we do not need to have the direct proof that money has actually exchanged hands, because fraudsters hide their tracks, do not leave a trail where you're going to find the money. But from the circumstantial evidence that we have to date, that is, the signing of the MOU before the RFP was given, the evaluation committee not doing what it ought to have done concerning due diligence, the fact that cabinet ministers were not notified and known with the ins and outs of the deal. Don't forget what Varist Bartolo has told us in one of his last outbursts, that the devil is in the detail. Obviously, the devil is the person who signed this agreement without the knowledge of cabinet, without cabinet's authorization, putting the buck back in the hands of corrupt Joseph Muscat and Chris Cardona. Chris Cardona is to inform the public who authorized him to sign the Memorandum of Understanding with Vitals. Was it the Prime Minister Muscat? Who of the ministers authorized this fact? The fact that, don't forget, Godfrey Farrugia, as Minister of Health, was changed at the 11th hour before the agreement of Vitals came to the fore.
Why do you think that was? Why do you think that happened?
Oh, of course, because Godfrey Farrugia would not have played ball to Joseph Muscat. He would have stopped a deal of this nature, and Conrad Mitzi was Muscat's placement to actually go along with the deal, with this done deal, at the expense of the public.
Dr. Debono, do you believe that the cabinet were not aware of the contract?
It is evident now that not only we've got the evidence of Professor Scicluna and Chris Fern that cabinet was not made aware of the ins and outs of this agreement, but this puts more responsibility on Professor Scicluna and Chris Fern for continuing to make payments to Vitals when they felt that this situation was untenable. This agreement was made to fail because money passed hands from the corruptors to the corrupted. Money passed, and we're talking of millions here, of hundreds of millions, and Joseph Muscat, as Prime Minister, as the person who I presume authorized Chris Cardona to sign the MOU, and the person who appointed Conrad Mitzi to finalize the deal, as the person who should have brought to cabinet the memos concerning the agreements reached, and the signing of the side letter of 100 million euros in the event that this case were to be lost, as well as, let's not forget, Mr. Muscat's receiving of funds of circa 60,000 euros from Akutur AG, which is a subsidiary of Vitals, is not stinks to high heaven. All these circumstantial evidence point towards Joseph Muscat, Chris Cardona, Conrad Mitzi, and they have to answer for the money laundering offences they have committed against the Maltese public. This is a fraud, a big fraud, bigger than the great railway train robbery which happened in the 60s in the United Kingdom.
Now that we have Vitals out of the way, what's the track record for stewards?
Stewards have failed the Maltese public. Stewards should not have entered into a deal with Vitals by acquiring the shares in a company which acted fraudulently. Do not forget that they had a case, they instituted a case against Ram Tumuluri and Ram Halli, if I'm not mistaken, in Malta, where they claimed that the Vitals deal was fraudulent. How can they now come and state that they did not know that this deal was fraudulent when, in another lawsuit which they filed against the ex-shareholders of Vitals, they claimed that this deal was fraudulent? And if they claimed that it was fraudulent, why did they buy the shares of this company? They are responsible as much as Vitals were for all that has happened in their dealings with the Malta government. They entered into the previous shareholders' shoes. And once they did that, they assumed total responsibility for all that has been done in this action. They are responsible as much as the Maltese government functionaries are, and they are to return all the money they have stolen from the Maltese people, not only which has fallen into the laps, but also the money they have paid Maltese functionaries who were responsible for the deal. And this is why the Commissioner of Police and the Attorney General should immediately, without any further delay, summon Joseph Muscat, Conrad Mitzi, and Chris Cardona for money laundering offences, together with Professor Scicluna and the Permanent Secretary of the Finance Ministry, Mr. Camilleri, because they should have never authorized payments of millions and millions of euros, which were already declared fraudulent by the Auditor General prior to the judgment of Mr. Justice De Pasquale. They knew that the Auditor General declared the deal fraudulent. From the day that this was declared so by the Auditor General, all payments made to stewards by the Malta government through the Ministry of Finance, through their authorization, are a serious breach of good governance, a serious breach of the way things should be managed and handled in a democracy.
Dr. Debono, I'd like to speak a bit about the funding to stewards from BOV. Can you talk us through that loan?
That is so inexplicable. I cannot understand how Bank of Valletta can demand from a simple depositor who went to the bank to encash a check of 10,000 euros, all due diligence required by law, and this prepared to loan stewards 36 million euros when the Auditor General found that this agreement was fraudulent. How is it possible that the management, the senior management of the bank, the directors of the bank, because now let's be quite frank, it is not a simple manager who authorized this. This would have gone through board of director level to loan 36 million euros to stewards who acted fraudulently with Maltese functionaries. But do not forget, this has to be investigated as well. Bank of Valletta, its main shareholder is the government of Malta. It appoints the chairman. And if the chairman was pressurized, or the board was pressurized to pass on this deal, they not only have to be give reasons for doing so to the shareholders, but also to the public in general. Here, monies of the public are at stake. Although government has pledged that it would make do any losses or any amounts which are not paid by stewards, but still, this is coming out from the Malta purse, which we all pay from our taxes.
What about compliance from the Bank of Valletta and the involvement of the MFSA?
No compliance was done, it's evident. And the MFSA has been obviously not diligent enough in penalizing Bank of Valletta from granting this loan when it ought not to have granted same. It has penalized APS quite recently, I think for a 200,000 euro penalty for some due diligence irregularities. Now, what penalties is Bank of Valletta going to pay for the irregularities of putting the money of depositors at stake by loaning 36 million to a fraudster?
It seems to me like there's a big hole. How can this money be repatriated, in your opinion, the money to BOV and the money to the government of Malta? How does this go about it?
One would expect that the government would immediately issue garnishee orders and file an action in Maltese courts to recoup all the monies that have been stolen from the people.
What if money is not available?
Well, if money is not available, we just have to frame Mr. Justice De Pasquale's judgment and say thank you to Mr. Joseph Muscat's government, to Mr. Abela's government and the Labour Party for putting Malta in the mess they have succeeded in putting her after 10 years. It is shameful.
What about repatriation of properties under other jurisdictions?
Well, if properties are found in other jurisdictions, they can obviously, through the normal legal channels, ensure that a Mareva injunction is issued in America against the assets of Vitals Stewards and ensure that all this would be impounded to ensure that no properties would be lost to third parties.
What, in your opinion, Dr. Debono, is required for a smooth transition to let go of stewards and start a hospital contract with another party?
I hope that what the Prime Minister intended to say is not what is going to happen, because this experience with Vitals and Stewards was absolutely a disaster, and I think our doctors have the capability to manage our hospitals with the help of the right professionals, accountants, auditors, and people in management with management roles, and we do not need this investment if this investment is not going to finish to the benefit of the Maltese public, but in the hands of four thieves in Castile.
What happens to employees who have contracts with stewards?
I presume government has assumed responsibility for the salaries and all that is all the work that they're doing, so I do not think that their work is actually in jeopardy.
Going forward on this case, what should the public be expecting?
That the Commissioner of Police and the Attorney General take immediate action against the fraudsters for money laundering offences, and as I have indicated, this should be directed against corrupt Muscat, corrupt Cardona, corrupt Mitzi, as well as against Professor Scicluna and Mr. Camilleri.
Thank you very much for watching our briefing in English, where we discussed the Vitals Stewards contracts with Dr. Edward Debono. Should you have any comments, please send them via WhatsApp on the number that appears on the screen. I'm Hogg for Net TV.